Background: Helen Thayer is a decorated explorer and adventurer. Her achievements include being the first woman to walk across the Sahara Desert, kayaking 1,200 miles across two rivers in the Amazon, and walking 1,600 miles across the Gobi Desert in Asia. In 1988, at the age of 50, she became the first woman to walk and ski to the North Pole without a snowmobile or dog sled. She wrote about her adventure in Polar Dream. I woke at 5:30 a.m. after a restless night's sleep. My hands were blistered clubs and hurt every time I touched something. Overnight, enormous blood blisters had formed to reach all the way down to the second joint of each finger, except my left little finger, which had somehow escaped freezing. I knew I had to keep the blisters intact so that my hands wouldn't become raw and bleeding. It would be better to use my heavy mitts as much as possible, even though they were clumsy. I thought back to the previous morning, remembering the crazy repacking of my sled with gear, ending up in all the wrong places as I just stood there not wanting to offend anyone. I decided what's done is done. One learns one's lessons the hard way sometimes, and besides, if that was to be the only problem of the whole expedition, then I would consider myself lucky. Reaching over, I painfully and slowly unzipped the tent door to inspect the new day. Just like yesterday, the wind had dropped. I looked out at cold, clear skies and a light northerly wind. Another beautiful Arctic day. Charlie was up and looking at his empty bowl. I crawled out of my sleeping bag, creating a minor snowstorm as I brushed against the frost-covered tent roof while I pulled on my jacket. I'm normally a morning person, but there was something about the intense cold, the tent frost down my neck, and my sore hands that made that morning most unappealing. But it was time to greet Charlie and start the day. Stepping out of the tent in my insulated blue camp booties, I checked the thermometer, minus 41 degrees. I looked around for bears or tracks and saw none, but I was surprised to notice that the shore ice, with its jagged blocks and pinnacles, ended only 100 feet from my tent. In the settling light of last evening, it had looked as if I was at least 400 yards from the closest rough ice shore ice, sorry. It was my first lesson in the sly nature of the changing Arctic light and the way it affected the depth perception. Charlie was bouncing up and down at the end of his chain, looking well rested. I hugged him, good morning, and his soft tongue wiped across my face. I poured what looked like a pound of dog food into his bowl, which he attacked with gusto. Now for my stove. I simply had to light it that morning. I needed water for the next leg of my journey, and a hot breakfast would get my day started off right. I carefully put a pair of woolen gloves over my liners, and with clenched teeth, I forced my cruelly protesting fingers to push the stove tube into the gasket at the top of the fuel bottle. Success. I lit it, put snow and ice into my 2-quart pan, and soon had warm water. To conserve fuel, I heated water only to a temperature at which I could put my finger into it. It was only 6 o'clock, so I decided to have a leisurely breakfast of a bowl of granola, milk powder, coconut flakes, raisins, and butter mixed with warm water. I sat on my sled to enjoy the full effect of my first breakfast of the expedition, only to find that after the third spoonful, it was frozen. So much for leisurely breakfasts. I added more warm water and ate the rest as fast as possible. Then I melted enough ice to fill 2 vacuum bottles with water and a carbohydrate powder. The dry Arctic air holds little moisture, causing quick dehydration of the body, which, in turn, causes early fatigue and reduces the body's ability to keep warm. So fluid would be just as important as food to keep my energy reserves up. I put my day's supply of crackers, cashews, walnuts, and peanut butter cups in my day food bag, along with the 2 vacuum bottles, and slipped everything down onto the front of the sled bag. Then, remembering Charlie's appetite for crackers, I added a few more. Last to be packed was the tent. I was completely engrossed. Oh dear. Sorry about that. I was completely engrossed in finding a way to twist the tent ice screws out of the ice so that my hands wouldn't scream in protest when suddenly I heard a deep, long growl coming from the depths of Charlie's throat. In a flash, I looked at him and then in the direction in which he was staring. I knew what I would see even before I looked. A polar bear. It was a female, followed by two cubs coming from Bathurst Island, slowly. Oh, look here, Bathurst Island, an uninhabited island that is part of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. From Bathurst Island, slowly, purposefully plodding through the rough shore ice toward me. They were 200 yards away. With a pounding heart, I grabbed my loaded rifle and flare gun and carefully walked sideways a few steps to Charlie, who was snarling with a savagery that caught my breath. Without taking my eyes off the bear, I unclipped Charlie from his ice anchor and, again walking sideways, I led him to the sled where I clipped his chain to a tie-down rope. The bear, now only 150 yards away, wasn't stopping. Her cubs had dropped back, but she came on with a steady, measured stride, while I frantically tried to remember all the Inuit had told me. And the Inuit, a group of people belonging to the Eskimo family who lived throughout the Canadian Arctic. All the Inuit had told me. Keep eye contact, move sideways or slightly forward, never backward, stay calm, don't show fear, stand beside a tent, sled, or other large object to make my 5 feet 3 inches appear as large as possible. Don't shoot unless forced to. Don't wound a bear, you'll make it even more dangerous, and never run. Repeating to myself, stay calm, I fired a warning shot to the bear's left. The loud explosion of the 338 had no effect. On she came. I fired a flare, landing it a little to her right. Her head moved slightly in its direction, but she didn't stop. I fired another flare, this time dropping it right in front of her. She stopped, looked at the flare burning a bright red on the white ice, then looked at me. She was only 100 feet away now. By this time, my nerves were as tight as violin strings, and my heart could have been heard at base camp. The bear began to step around the flare, and I dropped another flare 2 feet in front of her. Again, she stopped, looked at the flare and at me. Then she fixed her tiny black eyes on Charlie, who was straining at the end of his chain, snapping and snarling, trying to reach her. She looked back at her cubs. I could sense her concern about Charlie's snarling, rabid act and her cubs. She waited for her cubs to catch up, then moved to my left in a half circle. In spite of my sore fingers, I fired two more flares in quick succession, trying to draw a line between her and me. She stopped, then moved back toward my right. I fired two more flares, and again she stopped. She seemed to want to cross the line of flares, but was unsure of the result and of Charlie, so she elected to stay back. She kept moving right in a half circle, still 100 feet away. Finally, with a last long look, she plodded north with her two new cubs trotting behind her, their snow white coats contrasting with their mother's creamy, pale yellow color. The whole episode lasted 15 minutes, but seemed years long. I was a nervous wreck. My hands were shaking as I stood still, holding my rifle and flare gun, watching the trio slowly move north. But in spite of the mind-numbing fear that still gripped me, I could feel deep down inside a real satisfaction. I now knew that I could stand up to a bear in the wild, stay calm enough to function, and still remember the words of wisdom from the Inuit. With Charlie's help, I had passed my first test. The bear had been completely silent as it had approached and moved around me on paws, thickly padded with fur on the undersides. I was thankful for Charlie's warning. Now he had stopped growling and snarling, but still stood rigid, watching the bears as they zigzagged in and out of the rough ice hunting for the seals that lived in the cold waters beneath the ice. He seemed to hardly notice the giant hug I gave him. He was still on guard. The bears were only about 400 yards away, but I decided to continue packing my tent and move around to stay warm, still keeping a wary eye on the bears. I was getting cold. My fear and flowing adrenaline had kept me warm, but I was beginning to shiver now. I finished packing and stood around until 10 o'clock, keeping warm until I was sure the bears had disappeared and weren't circling back to me. If I stayed out from the coast, keeping away from the rough ice, I hoped to make up the time I had lost. But as I started out, I still thought about the bears. Even as frightened as I had been, it was a thrill to see a bear and her cubs in their natural environment. She was unafraid of me, powerful and dangerous, yet graceful, and she was a tender, attentive mother caring for her cubs.